Never mistake silence for strength, because the quietest goodbye is often the one that changes everything. I used to believe that nothing in my life could disappear without my permission. I controlled companies, negotiated impossible deals, and built an empire that stretched farther than I had ever imagined as a young man. Every person around me followed schedules I created, and every room I entered became quieter the moment I arrived. People called me disciplined. They called me brilliant. Some even called me untouchable. None of those words mattered the afternoon I lost the only person who had never asked me for anything except my attention. It started inside my office on the top floor of our Manhattan headquarters. Rain drifted softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the skyline into streaks of gray and silver. My executive team had already left, leaving only my longtime security chief, Daniel, standing near the conference table as we reviewed the final details of an upcoming business acquisition. The meeting had run longer than expected, and I glanced impatiently at my watch before gathering the last folder. Daniel hesitated for a moment before clearing his throat. "Sir, Mrs. Carter has been waiting downstairs for almost 40 minutes. She asked whether you might have dinner together tonight." I barely looked up from the documents in my hands. "Tell her I am busy." Daniel remained silent. That should have been the end of the conversation, but he spoke again with unusual caution. "She has been asking for dinner every Thursday this month." I sighed, more irritated by the interruption than the request itself. "Nathan," he said quietly, abandoning formal titles the way only someone who had worked beside me for more than 15 years could. "She seems disappointed." I closed the folder and finally looked at him. People become disappointed when they expect too much. Daniel lowered his eyes, clearly debating whether he should continue. "She has always been patient with you." A dry laugh escaped before I could stop it. "If Claire walked away today, I would never care." The sentence sounded effortless, calm, almost casual. I believed every word. While it left my mouth, Daniel stared at me without responding. Something in his expression shifted, though I could not understand why. Then he glanced briefly toward the office door before quietly excusing himself. I assumed another phone call demanded his attention. Instead, he was looking at someone standing just beyond the partially open door. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no crying. Only the soft click of the elevator doors somewhere down the hallway. Curious, I walked toward the entrance and pulled the door completely open. The reception area stood empty except for a small paper shopping bag resting neatly against the wall. I recognized it immediately. Claire always stopped by the same neighborhood bakery before visiting me. Inside the bag sat a still warm apple pie wrapped carefully with a handwritten note tucked beneath the ribbon. My favorite. I picked up the note without thinking. It read, "I know Thursdays have been difficult lately. I thought maybe we could eat together for just 30 minutes. I miss you. Love, Claire." My fingers tightened around the paper as I looked toward the elevator display. The numbers continued descending until they disappeared into the lobby. I considered calling after her. Instead, my phone vibrated with another incoming message about tomorrow's negotiations. I slipped the note into my pocket, convinced there would always be another dinner, another Thursday, another chance to explain. I walked back into my office and returned to work while the pie slowly cooled on the table behind me. Hours later, when the city lights reflected across the rain-covered glass and every employee had gone home, I finally noticed the untouched pie sitting alone beneath the dim office lights. It was the only thing Claire had left behind. At the time, I thought I had won another ordinary day by choosing work over everything else. I had no idea I had just watched the beginning of the longest regret of my life quietly walk out of the building without saying a single word. Nothing looked different the next morning, and that was exactly why I failed to understand what had already changed. The mansion remained perfectly organized. Sunlight poured through the tall windows onto polished marble floors. My coffee sat waiting at the end of the kitchen island exactly the way it always had. Margaret, our longtime housekeeper, greeted me with the same warm smile she had offered every morning for years. I finished breakfast while reviewing emails, glanced briefly at the newspaper beside my plate, and left for work convinced life had continued exactly as expected. The first day passed quickly. So did the second. Meetings replaced conversations. Contracts replaced dinners. Phone calls filled every empty minute until even silence became another task to complete. Claire never called. I noticed that, but I interpreted it as understanding rather than distance. She had always respected my schedule, and I assumed she finally accepted that work would always come first. On the third evening, I arrived home later than usual. The lights inside the mansion were already dimmed, and the familiar sound of soft piano music drifting through the hallway never came. Claire often played for herself after dinner, never because anyone asked her to, but because she said music made an enormous house feel less lonely. I loosened my tie while climbing the staircase before stopping outside the music room. The piano sat quietly beneath the window with its cover closed. A thin layer of dust had already settled across the polished black surface. I frowned without understanding why such a small detail unsettled me. "Where is Mrs. Carter?" I asked Margaret during breakfast the following morning. She hesitated only briefly before answering. "She has not been here since Thursday evening, sir." I looked up from my coffee. "Visiting friends?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I believe she left." Her words felt strangely incomplete. "Left where?" "I do not know, sir." I nodded once and returned to reading the financial section of the newspaper, convincing myself she simply needed time alone. Yet throughout the day, tiny interruptions began appearing inside routines I had never questioned before. My assistant entered my office carrying lunch instead of the homemade soup Claire usually sent every Friday. The white lilies that always stood in the conference room had disappeared, replaced by ordinary greenery selected by the building staff. My favorite fountain pen was missing from the inside pocket of my briefcase because Claire had always placed it there after polishing the leather every Sunday evening. None of these inconveniences mattered individually. Together they followed me like quiet echoes I could no longer ignore. That evening I returned home earlier than normal. The mansion felt unusually still. I walked into the living room and noticed the reading lamp beside Claire's favorite chair remained switched off. A half-finished novel rested exactly where she had left it days earlier, a dried maple leaf marking the page instead of a bookmark. Upstairs, our bedroom looked almost untouched, yet something invisible had disappeared from every corner. The fresh lavender fragrance that Claire loved had faded completely. Her framed photographs remained on the dresser, but the small vase of white flowers she replaced every week stood empty. I opened the closet expecting to see her coats neatly arranged beside mine. Several empty wooden hangers swayed gently after I touched them. Only then did I begin looking more carefully. Her everyday sweater was gone. Her travel bag had disappeared. The small jewelry box she inherited from her grandmother no longer rested on the shelf. She had not stormed out. She had simply taken the pieces of her own life without disturbing mine. I walked slowly back downstairs where the untouched apple pie from the bakery still rested inside the refrigerator, carefully wrapped the way I had placed it 1 week earlier. Margaret entered quietly behind me. "Sir," she said softly. "Mrs. Carter asked me not to tell you until she had settled somewhere else." I stared at the pie without answering. "She said you had enough important things to worry about." Those words settled heavily inside the silent kitchen. Claire had disappeared so gently that even her goodbye had been careful not to inconvenience me, and for the first time I wondered whether the greatest mistake of my life had not been what I said that Thursday afternoon, but how long she had already believed I would never notice she was gone. I spent the next several days telling myself that Claire only needed space. It was an explanation that sounded reasonable enough to keep me from asking harder questions. I buried myself in meetings that stretched from early morning until long after sunset, signed contracts worth millions of dollars, and listened to presentations that demanded complete attention. Everyone around me believed I was as focused as ever. They could not see that my concentration kept slipping toward a quiet apartment somewhere in the city where Claire might be unpacking books instead of waiting for me to come home. Every evening I reached for my phone before leaving the office, almost expecting to find a message asking whether I would be late for dinner. The screen remained empty. One afternoon Daniel entered my office carrying a folder of security reports before stopping near the window. "Sir, "There is something you should probably know." I looked up from my desk. "What is it?" He hesitated long enough to make me uneasy. "Mrs. Carter signed a lease 2 weeks before she left." I slowly lowered the document in my hands. 2 weeks. Daniel nodded. "She handled everything quietly. Small apartment on the Upper West Side. Nothing extravagant." I stared at him without speaking. Claire had planned her departure while still setting the table every evening, still asking whether I would be home for dinner, still placing fresh flowers around the house. She had not left because of one sentence. She had left because she had already stopped believing another answer would ever come. "Is she all right?" I finally asked. Daniel seemed surprised by the question. "From what I have been told, yes." I stood and walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Rain no longer covered the skyline. The city looked impossibly clear, as though every building had been carefully outlined against the bright autumn sky. "Anything else?" Daniel nodded once more. "She volunteers twice a week at a neighborhood literacy center." I turned toward him. "Volunteers?" "Yes, sir. Teaching adults and children how to read." The words settled quietly inside me. Claire had mentioned wanting to volunteer months earlier. I remembered answering without looking away from my laptop. I had said we could talk about it later. Apparently later had arrived without me. That Saturday morning I drove alone through streets I had rarely noticed before. Instead of towering office buildings and private entrances, I found tree-lined blocks filled with neighborhood coffee shops, bookstores, and families pushing strollers along wide sidewalks. I parked across the street from the address Daniel had given me. The community center was modest, built from warm red brick with colorful murals painted beside the entrance. Children laughed somewhere inside. Adults carried donated books through open doors. It looked nothing like the world Claire had shared with me, yet somehow it seemed to fit her perfectly. I remained inside the car longer than I intended. Then I saw her. Claire stepped outside carrying a stack of picture books against her sweater. She laughed at something a little girl said before kneeling to straighten the child's backpack. Her smile came so naturally that I almost failed to recognize it. There was no hesitation, no careful effort to appear cheerful for someone else's comfort. It was simply happiness existing without permission. An older woman thanked her for organizing the reading program, and Claire embraced her warmly before waving goodbye to several families leaving the building. I searched my memory for the last time I had seen that expression while she lived beside me. I could not find it. A few moments later, another volunteer walked outside carrying folding chairs. He smiled at Claire, and she smiled back with easy familiarity as they worked together without saying much. There was nothing improper between them, only the relaxed comfort of two people who enjoyed helping others. Yet watching that simple moment unsettled me more deeply than any rival ever could. Claire had not escaped into a better life because someone rescued her. She had built it herself after quietly accepting that I never would. As I watched her disappear back inside the community center surrounded by books, children, and genuine laughter, one painful truth became impossible to deny. She had not been waiting for me to notice she was unhappy. She had simply stopped waiting altogether. After that Saturday, I stopped pretending the silence would eventually fix itself. I still woke before sunrise, still wore tailored suits, still walked through polished boardrooms where everyone waited for my decisions, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not explain. Every successful negotiation felt strangely hollow because the moment I returned to an empty mansion, the silence was waiting for me again. It no longer felt peaceful, felt honest. I found myself replaying ordinary memories that I had ignored while they were happening. Claire asking if I wanted to take a walk through Central Park on Sunday morning. Claire leaving a handwritten note beside my coffee wishing me luck before an important meeting. Claire sitting quietly across from me at dinner while I answered emails instead of looking into her eyes. None of those moments had seemed important at the time. Together they became a life I had chosen not to live. One evening I unlocked the front door and instinctively called her name before realizing there was nobody there to answer. The sound echoed softly through the hallway before disappearing into the stillness. I stood there much longer than I intended with my hand still resting on the doorknob. The house had become a museum filled with reminders of someone who had once made every room feel alive. A few days later, I drove past the community center again. I told myself it was only because the route happened to be convenient, but even I no longer believed my own excuses. I parked across the street beneath a row of golden maple trees, whose leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk in the cool October breeze. Children laughed as families arrived carrying backpacks and library books. Volunteers greeted everyone by name. No one rushed. No one checked expensive watches. Time seemed to move differently there. I watched Claire step outside carrying a cardboard box filled with donated novels. She smiled at an elderly gentleman who struggled with the door and immediately hurried over to help him without being asked. A little boy ran toward her holding a drawing made with bright crayons. She knelt beside him, studied every detail as though it belonged in an art gallery, and laughed with genuine delight before carefully placing the picture inside her tote bag. I had spent years believing expensive gifts proved affection. That child had offered her a piece of paper, and she treated it like treasure. Then I heard laughter again. The same volunteer I had noticed days earlier walked outside carrying 2 paper coffee cups. He handed one to Claire, and she accepted it with grateful surprise. They sat together on the front steps while discussing something that made both of them smile. I could not hear a single word, yet their conversation seemed effortless. There was no performance, no pressure, only 2 people sharing an ordinary afternoon. I should have felt jealous. Instead, I felt ashamed. The problem was never another man. The problem had always been the version of myself that believed providing luxury was the same as providing love. As I continued watching from across the street, Claire looked up toward the autumn sky, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and simply breathed. It struck me that I had not seen her look so peaceful in years. My phone vibrated with another message asking me to approve an acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I stared at the notification before locking the screen without reading it. For the first time in my career, the deal could wait. My attention remained fixed on the woman I had once assumed would always be waiting for me instead. Sitting alone inside my car, I finally understood that the sentence I had spoken inside my office had never stopped echoing. Nobody repeated it to punish me. Nobody reminded me of it. My own memory had become the loudest voice in my life, and every quiet moment forced me to hear it again. Success had given me influence over almost everything around me, but it could not silence the regret created by my own careless words. And as Claire disappeared back inside the community center carrying books instead of expectations, I realized the hardest person to forgive would not be her. It would be the man staring back at me every morning in the mirror. I stopped driving past the community center every day because I realized watching Claire rebuild her life from a distance was becoming another form of selfishness. I had spent years believing love meant keeping someone close to me. Now I understood that love also meant respecting the space someone needed to heal from the hurt I had caused. For the first time in my adult life, I looked at my own routines instead of someone else's. Every morning began before sunrise, yet I could not remember the last sunrise I had actually watched. Every meal had been scheduled between meetings instead of shared with another human being. Even weekends had become extensions of the workweek. I had built a life that rewarded achievement while quietly starving everything that made achievement meaningful. One afternoon, Daniel knocked gently before entering my office. He placed a folder on my desk but made no effort to open it. "You asked me to stop monitoring Mrs. Carter unless there was a genuine reason to be concerned," he said. "There is nothing concerning." I nodded. "Good." He remained standing. "There is something you may want to know anyway." I looked at him. "Go ahead." "The volunteer you saw with her is named Ethan Brooks. He teaches history at a public high school. His father retired from the fire department after 30 years of service. His mother spent most of her career as a librarian. He volunteers every Saturday because he believes reading changes lives." Daniel paused before continuing. "Everything about him appears exactly as it seems." I almost smiled at the irony. Years ago, I would have asked for far more information. Instead, I quietly closed the folder without opening it. "That is enough," I said. Daniel studied me for a moment before giving a small nod. "Yes, sir." After he left, I sat alone looking at the unopened folder. There had been a time when I believed every person could be understood through reports, financial records, and background checks. Claire had spent years beside me proving that the most valuable parts of a person never appeared on paper. That evening I drove home instead of returning to the office. The sun was still above the skyline, casting warm orange light across the city. For once I did not answer the emails waiting on my phone. I stopped at the neighborhood grocery store near the mansion, something I had not done in years because someone else always handled ordinary errands for me. Walking through the aisles felt strangely unfamiliar. I stood staring at dozens of coffee brands because I realized I had never known which one Claire preferred. She had always remembered mine. I reached for fresh flowers before instinctively choosing white lilies. Halfway to the checkout counter I stopped. Claire was no longer there to place them in crystal vases throughout the house. I bought them anyway. When I returned home, Margaret looked surprised to see me carrying groceries instead of a briefcase. "Would you like me to arrange the flowers, sir?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "No, I would like to learn." She smiled with quiet kindness and showed me how to trim each stem before placing them carefully into water. It was such a simple task that I almost laughed at myself. I had negotiated international agreements worth extraordinary sums of money, yet I had never learned how to keep flowers alive for more than a few days because Claire had always done it without asking for recognition. As evening settled over the mansion, I placed the vase on the dining table where we had shared so few meals together. The room remained empty, but something inside me felt different. I was no longer asking how to bring Claire back. I was beginning to ask how I had become a man who could overlook so many quiet acts of love without ever noticing them. That question stayed with me long after the lights were turned off, and I finally understood that changing my life could not begin with convincing Claire to forgive me. It had to begin with becoming someone she would never have needed to forgive in the first place. The weeks that followed did not transform me overnight, and I was grateful for that. Quick change would have been another illusion, another shortcut for a man who had spent years believing every problem could be solved by making a decision. This was different. Every day demanded another choice, another habit, another quiet reminder that becoming a better man required consistency instead of confidence. I began leaving the office before sunset at least twice a week. At first my executives looked confused, as though the building itself might stop functioning without me sitting in the corner office until midnight. It did not. Meetings continued. Contracts were signed. Problems found solutions without my constant presence. The empire I had sacrificed my marriage to protect turned out to be far less fragile than I had imagined. One Friday evening Margaret smiled as she placed 2 bowls of homemade soup on the dining table before stopping herself. She quietly carried 1 bowl back to the kitchen. I watched her for a moment before speaking. "Leave it there." She looked surprised. "Sir." I nodded toward the empty chair across from mine. "Please." She said nothing else. We both understood the second bowl would remain untouched, but somehow the empty place at the table deserved to exist. I finished dinner slowly without opening my laptop once. Afterward, I walked into the library instead of my office. Shelves filled with leather-bound books surrounded me, yet I realized I had never read most of them. Claire used to spend quiet evenings there with a blanket across her lap, always inviting me to join her for just 1 chapter. I had usually answered that I would come in a few minutes. Those minutes had quietly become years. I pulled a novel from the shelf and sat in the chair beside the window where she always preferred to read. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the Hudson River, while autumn slowly surrendered to early winter. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I allowed myself to sit without trying to accomplish anything. The silence no longer felt like punishment, felt like a teacher. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cold air. Instead of driving toward the office, I found myself returning to the neighborhood where the community center stood. This time I did not remain inside the car. I walked to the coffee shop across the street and ordered a simple cup of black coffee before sitting near the front window. Families passed by carrying books and backpacks. Volunteers greeted one another with easy smiles. Claire appeared a few minutes later wearing a navy blue coat and a knitted scarf. She looked healthy, peaceful. She carried a cardboard box filled with donated children's books, while Ethan held the door open for her. They exchanged a few words before laughing softly about something I could not hear. A strange calm settled over me. Weeks earlier I would have searched for reasons to resent him. Now all I could see was someone treating Claire with the ordinary kindness I had failed to give her when she needed it most. I finished my coffee without approaching the building. Before leaving, I stopped inside a nearby bookstore. A display near the entrance featured children's stories requested by local teachers and literacy programs. Without thinking, I purchased several copies and asked the cashier to deliver them anonymously to the community center. She smiled warmly as she wrote down the address. "Would you like to include your name?" she asked. I looked at the receipt for a long moment before shaking my head. "No," I answered quietly. "The books are what matter." Walking back toward my car, I realized something unexpected had changed inside me. For the first time since Claire left, I had done something because it might make someone else's day a little brighter instead of because I hoped it would change how they saw me. The feeling was unfamiliar, almost humbling, and as the cold wind carried golden leaves across the sidewalk, I understood that trust could never be requested, forgiveness could never be negotiated, and love could never be earned through grand speeches alone. It would only recognize the quiet evidence of a life that had finally learned to place another person's happiness beside its own. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city with pale morning frost and reminding me that time continued moving whether I was ready or not. Nearly 3 months had passed since Claire left the mansion, and for the first time in years I measured my life by ordinary moments instead of business quarters. I remembered the evenings I spent reading instead of answering endless emails. I remembered learning the names of the employees who had worked beside me for years without ever having a real conversation with me. I remembered delivering another anonymous donation of books to the community center and driving away before anyone noticed. None of those choices erased my mistakes, but they slowly reshaped the man who had made them. One Tuesday afternoon, Daniel stepped into my office holding a familiar envelope. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he placed it gently on my desk and waited. I recognized Claire's handwriting before I even reached for it. My heart beat faster than it had during any business negotiation I had ever faced. Inside were legal documents requesting the final steps to dissolve our marriage. There was no angry letter, no accusations, no attempt to make me feel guilty, only a brief handwritten note clipped neatly to the first page. "Nathan, thank you for respecting the space I needed. I truly hope you find the peace both of us were searching for. Claire." I read those 2 sentences 3 times before setting the papers aside. Months earlier, I would have searched for lawyers and strategies. Instead, I sat quietly, understanding that love had never been something I could defend through arguments or contracts. Margaret found me that evening sitting alone in the library with the unsigned documents resting beside a closed book. She placed a warm cup of tea near my chair before speaking softly. "She always believed you had a kind heart." I looked up. "Then why did I make her so unhappy?" Margaret smiled with the gentle patience only someone much older could possess. "Because kindness that is never shown eventually feels exactly like absence." Her words settled deeply inside me. I thought back to every time I believed providing security was enough. Every expensive vacation postponed because another meeting seemed more urgent. Every birthday dinner interrupted by another phone call. Every promise to spend more time together after just one more successful quarter. I had always imagined love could wait until I finished building my future. I never realized our future had been quietly passing by while I was making plans for it. A few days later, I stopped by the community center carrying another anonymous box of children's books. Before I could leave, the director stepped outside holding the package with a puzzled smile. "Excuse me," she called. I turned around. "Were these from you?" For a brief moment, I considered denying it. Instead, I nodded. "Yes." She thanked me warmly before explaining how many families would enjoy them during the winter reading program. As we spoke, Claire stepped into the hallway behind the glass entrance doors. She noticed me immediately. Our eyes met for the first time in months without the protection of distance. She walked outside slowly, wrapping her scarf a little tighter against the cold breeze. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, she offered a small, polite smile. "Hello, Nathan." I smiled back just as gently. "Hello, Claire." There was no anger in her voice. There was also no familiarity. We sounded like two respectful strangers who happened to share old memories. She glanced toward the box of books before looking back at me. "The children will love those." "I hope they do." Another quiet silence settled between us, but this one no longer felt unbearable. It simply felt honest. Claire studied my face for a moment before saying something I had not expected. "You seem different." I lowered my eyes briefly before answering. "I am trying to become someone better than the man you left." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the families arriving for the afternoon reading program. When she finally turned back to me, there was kindness in her eyes, but also careful distance earned through months of healing. "Keep becoming that man," she said softly. "Do not do it for me. Do it because you deserve to know who he is." She walked back inside before I could answer, leaving me standing beneath the pale winter sky with the unsigned envelope still waiting at home and one quiet realization growing stronger than ever before. Real change is not measured by the moment someone notices it. It is measured by the day you continue choosing it even after they walk away. The envelope remained on my desk for another week, untouched except for the times I found myself reading Claire's short note again. I realized I had been searching for one perfect moment to explain everything I had finally learned, but life rarely offered perfect moments. It only offered honest ones. On the first Saturday before Christmas, I drove to the community center carrying nothing except a simple paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Inside were fresh apple pies, still warm, the same kind Claire had once brought to my office on an ordinary Thursday that I had treated like every other day. This time I was the one waiting. Families filled the building with cheerful conversations while children hurried through the hallways carrying books almost as large as their backpacks. Volunteers decorated the reading room with paper snowflakes and handmade ornaments. The atmosphere felt wonderfully imperfect, full of laughter that could never be scheduled or controlled. Claire noticed me almost immediately. She walked toward me with calm steps, neither welcoming nor avoiding me. "Good morning, Nathan," she said gently. I held out the bakery bag. "I thought everyone might enjoy these after the reading session." She accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you. They will." Before she turned away, I quietly said her name. She paused. "Would you give me a few minutes after everyone leaves?" She looked at me for a long moment before nodding once. A few minutes. Those words stayed with me throughout the afternoon. Instead of waiting outside, I asked one of the volunteers whether they needed help arranging chairs after the children's program. An older gentleman handed me a stack without hesitation. Nobody cared who I was. Nobody recognized my name. I spent the next hour folding tables, carrying boxes of books, sweeping bits of colored paper from the floor, and listening to children proudly read stories aloud. Their excitement over every completed sentence reminded me that progress was never measured by giant leaps. Sometimes it was only one page at a time. When the last family finally left, the building became peacefully quiet. Claire stepped onto the front porch while soft snow began drifting through the afternoon air. She wrapped her coat more tightly around herself before, looking at me with patient curiosity. I took a slow breath. "I did not ask to speak with you because I wanted to change your decision." She remained silent, allowing me to continue. "I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what happened." I looked down at the fresh snow gathering around my shoes. For months, I believed my greatest mistake was one sentence. I shook my head slowly. It was much bigger than that. The sentence only revealed the man I had already become. "I made you feel alone while sitting beside me. I treated your patience like it had no limit. I expected tomorrow to repair everything I ignored today." My voice remained calm, but every word felt heavier than the one before it. "You deserved to be heard long before you had to leave in silence." Claire looked toward the quiet street before meeting my eyes again. I saw emotion there, but also wisdom earned through difficult months. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. I waited. It was not hearing those words. She smiled sadly. "It was realizing I believed them the moment you said them." Her honesty settled gently between us. There was no anger left inside her voice, only truth. I nodded because I had no right to argue with it. I am sorry, Claire. Those 3 words were simpler than every speech I had rehearsed, yet they carried everything I had failed to say before. Not because I lost you, because I failed you while I still had you. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. Thank you for saying that. We stood quietly watching snowflakes settle across the sidewalk. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Finally, Claire smiled, small but genuine. Whatever happens next, I am glad you found yourself. I returned her smile with unexpected peace. For the first time since she walked away, I understood that an apology was never meant to reopen a closed door. Sometimes its greatest purpose was simply to honor the person who deserved to hear it, even if they chose a different path afterward. 3 months passed before spring finally softened the edges of another New York winter. Snow disappeared from sidewalks, trees slowly recovered their color, and the city seemed to breathe a little easier with every warmer morning. My life had settled into rhythms I once believed impossible. I still led my company, but I no longer allowed it to consume every hour I owned. Every Tuesday evening I left the office before sunset. Every Saturday morning I volunteered at the community center, shelving donated books, repairing old tables, reading stories to children who celebrated every new word they learned. Nobody treated me differently because of what I had accomplished outside those walls. I was simply another volunteer wearing a name tag and carrying boxes from one room to another. Strangely, that became the place where I felt most like myself. Claire and I saw each other often, yet neither of us forced conversations that were not ready to happen. We greeted one another with quiet smiles, worked side by side whenever help was needed, and slowly discovered something we had never truly shared before. We learned how to exist in the same space without expectations. One Saturday afternoon, the annual neighborhood reading celebration filled the community center with families, music, and folding tables covered with homemade desserts. Children proudly read short stories aloud while parents applauded every page. I watched Claire encouraging a nervous little girl before she stepped onto the small stage. The child stumbled over several words, paused, looked toward Claire, and found the courage to continue. When the story ended, the applause echoed through the room. Claire never stepped into the spotlight herself. She simply smiled because someone else had found confidence. That was who she had always been. I had simply been too distracted to see it. As the celebration came to an end, volunteers folded chairs while families drifted home beneath the warm afternoon sun. Claire approached me carrying a familiar envelope. I recognized it immediately. The divorce papers remained inside, still unsigned by either of us. She looked down at them before offering a gentle smile. I visited my attorney this week, she said quietly. I waited without speaking. She held the envelope for another moment before placing it into my hands. I asked him not to file them. I looked at her in disbelief. Claire. She raised her hand slightly, stopping me before I could say anything else. This is not because you apologized. Her voice remained calm. It is not because you brought books or flowers or volunteered every weekend. I listened carefully. It is because every time I have seen you these past months, you have been the same man. You never asked for another chance. You never tried to pressure me. You simply kept becoming someone different. I lowered my eyes toward the envelope before looking back at her. I cannot promise I will never disappoint you again, I admitted honestly. But I can promise I will never again make you wonder whether your heart matters to me. Claire's eyes glistened softly in the afternoon light. That is the first promise I have ever believed. We left the community center together and began walking through the neighborhood without deciding where we were going. Children laughed behind us as volunteers locked the doors for the evening. Cherry blossoms drifted gently across the sidewalk, carried by a warm breeze that smelled faintly of fresh rain and blooming flowers. I did not reach for Claire's hand immediately. This time I allowed the silence to exist without trying to control it. A few moments later, she quietly slipped her hand into mine. It was a small gesture, almost weightless, yet it carried more meaning than every expensive gift I had ever purchased. We continued walking beneath the fading sunlight without hurrying the moment. I once believed success was measured by the size of the empire a man could build. I know better now. Success fills calendars, bank accounts, and headlines. Love fills ordinary mornings, quiet dinners, patient conversations, and the empty places that finally become home because two people choose each other again every single day. If my life has taught me anything worth remembering, it is this. The words spoken in pride may last only seconds, but the kindness shown with consistency can rewrite an entire future, one quiet day at a time.